Ethan believed the next paycheck would finally make things easier. It wasn't the first time he'd told himself that. Every month began with the quiet feeling that this one would finally be different. For a few days, it actually seemed true. The bills were paid, the groceries were stocked, the pressure finally eased. Then, almost without realizing it, Ethan watched his account begin drifting toward the same familiar number it always seemed to find before payday returned. Nothing unexpected had happened. No emergency, no major expense. Which made the ending strangely difficult to explain, because there was never one obvious decision large enough to deserve all the blame. So, he searched for the reason. Just like most people would. Maybe prices had simply become impossible to keep up with. Or maybe one larger paycheck would finally create enough breathing room to leave this exhausting pattern behind for good. But what if every new paycheck wasn't moving Ethan forward at all, quietly restarting the same invisible cycle before another month had even begun? Before we continue, let's step back for a moment. Because Ethan's story isn't unusual. In fact, it may feel more familiar than any of us would like to admit. Welcome to Lyon Invests. This channel isn't about getting rich overnight. It's about questioning the financial beliefs that quietly shape the way we earn, spend, save, and build wealth. Because once you understand the pattern, you start seeing money differently. If that's the kind of thinking you're looking for, I'd love to have you subscribe. Now, let's go back to Ethan. Because the answer wasn't hiding inside his paycheck nearly as much as it was hiding inside what happened after it arrived. Ethan eventually noticed something that had been sitting in plain sight every single month, yet somehow had never felt important enough to question. The paycheck always changed his balance immediately, but it also changed something far less visible that no banking app could ever display. Without realizing it, he stopped asking whether he should spend each dollar, because simply seeing more money made almost every decision feel a little safer. The change wasn't dramatic, it was almost impossible to notice. One purchase felt reasonable, then another, then another. None of those decisions seemed large enough to matter, which is exactly why they quietly escaped the attention they probably deserved. By themselves, each choice looked ordinary, responsible, and completely forgettable, making it almost impossible to believe they were connected in any meaningful way. Yet when the month finally ended, every one of those ordinary moments combined into one result that somehow felt surprising all over again. Ethan remembered feeling short on money. He didn't remember the pattern that quietly built that feeling, and that's when a different question began replacing the old one. Instead of asking, "Where did my money go?" Ethan found himself wondering whether the real mystery was why the same story kept repeating, even when every month began with a completely different promise. That question stayed with Ethan longer than any unpaid bill, because it challenged something he had quietly believed for years. He had always assumed earning money and keeping money were almost the same skill, just different parts of the same journey. But the more he replayed each month in his mind, the more those two ideas began drifting farther apart than he had ever imagined. What if the paycheck was never the beginning of the story, only the beginning of the cycle? The thought felt uncomfortable because it suggested the problem might not be hiding inside his income after all. It might be hiding inside the invisible routine that quietly came to life every single time the money reached his account. Ethan wasn't waking up each morning planning to waste money, and that was exactly what made the pattern so difficult to recognize. Every decision made perfect sense, until he looked backward instead of forward. Buying lunch saved time. Ordering delivery felt deserved. Renewing another subscription barely seemed worth noticing. None of those choices felt connected while they were happening, because the brain naturally experiences them as separate moments instead of one continuous pattern. Yet his bank account remembered something his memory never seemed to hold on to. It didn't remember intentions, it remembered outcomes. That difference quietly changed everything Ethan thought he understood about his own financial life. For the first time, he stopped searching for one expensive mistake and started wondering whether dozens of ordinary decisions were telling one much larger story. Suddenly, the mystery wasn't where the money had gone. It was how the pattern kept rebuilding itself. Behavioral psychologists have long observed that repeated actions slowly become familiar, and familiar actions eventually begin feeling normal whether they help us or not. Ethan couldn't remember choosing the pattern anymore, because repetition had quietly replaced conscious decision-making with something that felt almost automatic. The cycle didn't ask for permission. It simply waited for the next payday. Then, almost invisibly, it invited the same comfortable habits to take the same familiar path once again. That's why the ending always felt unexpected, even though the beginning looked almost identical every single month. The cycle wasn't powered by one bad decision, one expensive purchase, or one moment of weakness that could easily be avoided. It was powered by ordinary choices that never felt important enough to question, while they were quietly becoming part of a routine. Ethan finally realized he hadn't been repeating purchases. He had been repeating a pattern of thinking. And once that possibility entered his mind, another question became impossible to ignore. If patterns quietly shape financial outcomes, where do those patterns come from before we ever notice they're guiding our decisions? Ethan couldn't remember the day that pattern had first begun, which made him wonder if it had been growing long before he ever noticed it. Most habits don't arrive all at once. They arrive one ordinary day at a time until they stop feeling new. The first coffee on the way to work wasn't really about coffee. It was about making the morning feel easier. The first meal ordered instead of cooked wasn't really about food, because buying back a little time felt completely reasonable after a long day. None of those decisions seemed connected, yet together they quietly began writing a financial routine Ethan never realized he was creating. That's what made the cycle so convincing. It never looked like a cycle. It looked like life unfolding one completely reasonable decision after another, making the larger pattern almost impossible to recognize while living through it. Looking backward changed everything, because separate memories suddenly connected into one story his bank account had been telling all along. Ethan finally understood why the ending always surprised him. He had only been watching individual chapters. The bank account had been reading the entire book. That's when another hidden truth quietly revealed itself, and it had nothing to do with income, budgeting, or finding better discounts. It had everything to do with repetition, because repetition quietly turns temporary behavior into something that begins feeling permanent. Once the brain accepts a routine as normal, it stops questioning it. That isn't a character flaw or a lack of discipline, but a remarkably efficient way for the brain to conserve energy every single day. The same process that helps us tie our shoes without thinking can also repeat financial habits without asking whether they still deserve a place in our lives. Suddenly, Ethan realized he wasn't making every spending decision from the beginning each month. Many decisions had already been made by yesterday's routine. That's why changing one purchase rarely changes the outcome, because the pattern quietly finds another path to produce the same familiar ending. Breaking a cycle isn't about fighting one decision. It's about noticing the pattern behind hundreds of them. And that's where mathematics quietly enters the story. Not to make it more complicated, but to make it easier to finally see. One small purchase almost never changes a financial future. One repeated purchase eventually can. The difference isn't the size of the number, it's the number of times it quietly repeats. Small amounts multiplied by familiar routines eventually become outcomes that feel far larger than the individual decisions ever did. Ethan had spent months searching for one big leak, while dozens of tiny streams quietly flowed in the same direction every single day. And once he finally saw those streams connecting together, the cycle no longer looked mysterious. It looked predictable, which raised one final question before everything changed. If the cycle can be learned so quietly, could it also be unlearned just as deliberately? That question changed everything, because Ethan finally stopped looking for a better paycheck and started looking for a better pattern instead. It wasn't a dramatic moment of transformation. It was a quiet shift in the way he looked at every ordinary decision. He realized that every dollar arriving in his account wasn't simply money to spend. It was a decision waiting to be made. And every decision quietly became practice for the next one. The cycle had never been built in a single day, which meant it probably couldn't disappear in one day either. That wasn't discouraging. It was strangely freeing. If repetition created the cycle, then repetition could also create something entirely different, one ordinary decision at a time. The goal was never perfection, because perfection usually disappears the moment life becomes inconvenient. The goal was awareness. Awareness changes choices before choices become habits. Ethan no longer asked whether he could afford something. He asked what repeating that decision might quietly build over the next few years. The question didn't make every purchase disappear, but it changed the meaning behind every purchase that remained. Some expenses were no longer just expenses. They became investments in time, health, relationships, or genuine happiness. Others quietly revealed themselves as routines that had survived only because they had never been questioned before. For the first time, Ethan wasn't trying to control every dollar. He was learning to recognize the pattern directing those dollars, and once the pattern became visible, it slowly began losing the power it had held for years. Looking back, Ethan realized the hidden cycle had never been stealing his money. It had been quietly shaping his decisions. The money had only followed the path those decisions created. That changed the story completely. Because paths can change. Most people spend years searching for one financial breakthrough that will finally solve everything. Yet lasting change rarely begins with one extraordinary moment, because it usually grows from ordinary moments repeated in a different direction. That's why two people earning the same income can slowly build completely different financial futures over time. The difference often isn't found in one paycheck. It's found in the pattern that quietly follows it. Maybe the hidden cycle draining your money was never invisible because it was complicated. Maybe it was invisible because it always looked so ordinary. And once you begin noticing the patterns behind your own decisions, you may discover that the future changes long before your income ever does. Ethan thought he was waiting for a different paycheck to change his life. In the end, he discovered he had been waiting for a different way of seeing the same paycheck all along. And perhaps that's the story quietly unfolding in more lives than we ever realize.